Welcome back to the channel. So, as you've probably now guessed from the title, this rusty £600 BMW is destined to be an ultra low budget race car. This video is how we got the car up to the bare minimum standard to go racing on a shoestring budget, and a first attempt to do so on a real racetrack participating in a real event. I know in one of my previous videos we did the 4 hours of Lochgelly Endurance Challenge in Scotland, but that was more of a haggard banger race where the goal was just to survive without having your car totaled. This time around we are taking it to the next level and doing things quote unquote properly. Since the last video, a lot of work has happened to the Beamer. On day one, we got the wheels off and started poking around to see what needed replacing. It was obvious from the get-go that the suspension needed replaced at the rear, but the front shocks were also in need of replacing, so they were removed and some cheapo Chinese coilovers were ordered from Germany. When we took a look at the rear suspension, both shocks were leaking and one of the lowering springs had snapped, so the coilovers were the cheapest option to replace all 4 corners. The brakes were in pretty decent condition, although I already knew the fronts were fine when I changed the wheel bearing and the front brake discs, so no surprises there. The rear calipers were good, but we did change the bleed nipples all around since we would be bleeding the brakes a little bit later on anyway. The rear discs did need changing, and when we took them off, the drum brakes used for the handbrake basically just disintegrated in our hands. They weren't needed for racing, so they were removed along with the rusty dust guards so there would be slightly more airflow to cool the brakes. There was a clunking coming from the rear end, so we had to poke around and found that almost every bushing needed replaced. We also took everything off the diff and checked the backlash, but it felt surprisingly tight considering the age and mileage of the vehicle. This was also a good time to check the prop shaft bearing, and it was pretty ruined. It did make a bit of noise when I gave it a spin, and the rubber was very cracked. The rear section of the prop shaft was also fused to the differential, so only the front half that had the bearing fitted was removed. We did also start removing the interior from the back, but after a closer inspection of the rules, we had to refit at least the seats as a standard interior was stipulated as a requirement, and that brought us to the end of day 1. Day 2 started with some disappointment since the parts I'd ordered a week prior had not arrived. The only parts we could change were the upper outer rear control arm bushings, so we got to work on that. It was a pig of a job, but we got them out and the new bushes in with a basic G-clamp style bushing press. We also removed the lower bush from the hub as well, just to get a head start on the job when the parts did arrive, along with removing the upper control arms. The control arms were very rusty, and one of the bushings that needed replacing were pressed into the arms, so they needed replacing regardless, but it was a surprise to find that one side was pretty badly bent. The car had been pulling to the left, so it was good the replacement part was already on its way. There was a slight leak from the expansion tank, so that was taken out. Some silicone applied around the top where the gasket looked like it had failed, and some plumber's tape added to some of the hose mounts. The car didn't have any coolant issues in the time I'd been driving it, so this was purely done because we can't top up the coolant at a racetrack when the engine's hot. One of the few parts that had arrived were our brand new Max Peding rods coilovers. It amazes me that these Chinese companies don't have someone proofread their literal company names, but I don't know. What's a missing S between friends? These coilovers didn't come with top mounts, which is common with the really low end stuff. Fitting the rear shock top mounts was easy enough though, or so I thought, as you'll find out later on in the video. But the fronts required spring compressors, which we didn't have. Our solution was to use some big grips to compress the springs using cable ties, which did work, but removing that first top mount made me nervous enough to only be the cameraman. There was just a little pop when the nut was off the thread, so the cable tie compression trick did seem to work. The final job was trying to bodge the rear diff bushing. The rubber was very perished, but we didn't want to remove the diff entirely from the car, especially since the prop shaft was stuck on, so we decided to reinforce the bushing instead to try and give it more rigidity. One of the team had this moldable plastic stuff that felt like polyurethane. It turned into a melted toffee-like substance when heated to 100 degrees, so it was softened up in some hot water and pressed into place using a homemade blade washer. The same was done for the other side. That was the end of day 2, and this was the last weekend before we were scheduled to go racing, and the car looked like this. Day 3 was a Friday, with the Saturday being tech inspection and the Sunday being the actual race, so we were not in the best situation. I'd found some time to fit the lower rear control arm bushings, and the last of the parts had arrived, but we still only had one day to finish everything. We started off with the tie rod ends, which were supposed to be an easy job, but turned into a fiasco. They were so rusted on, no matter what we tried, they wouldn't come off, and the grooves that were cut into the sides for doing the alignment were just rounding off. The years of Scottish weather had really taken its toll. I had to rush off to an auto parts store to buy some inner tie rods so we could just replace the entire tie rod. Luckily, there were some in stock since E46s are still a pretty common car in Prague, so they were swapped relatively painlessly. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of footage of the rest of the day because although this is a YouTube video and almost everything on the internet is fake, we legitimately didn't have enough time for me to take loads of time off Spanring to take videos. Getting the car finished was the priority. So the prop shaft bearing was replaced, the prop shaft refitted, the differential bolted back in along with the drive shafts and the diff bushing reinforcement pieces. The suspension was bolted in, front control arm bushes changed, front drop links swapped for shorter ones since it had coilovers now, the expansion tank refitted and the coolant topped up, the rear control arms fitted, threw the interior back in, gave it an oil and filter change, and then we had to call it a night. There are only so many hours in the day. Day 4 was tech inspection day, so we did have a few hours in the morning to finish the last of everything. One of the team had flown in from Manchester the night before and brought some EBC yellow stuff brake pads, so the first job was to get the brakes fitted and bled so it could get back on its wheels. The brake hoses looked okay, so they were left standard, but we gave it a brake fluid flush with Motul RBF 600 fluid that's designed for racing. I know some people now say the RBF 660 is better, but it was more expensive and I felt like this is probably a good opportunity to see if it is really necessary spending the extra on the more recent fluid. So the brakes and clutch were bled, which made the pedal feel great, and the car was finally able to be put back on its wheels. Luckily for us, one of the guys who was helping out knew a guy who had recently crashed his BMW and had the old wheels lying around. He let us have them and a set of 4 winter tyres for only 1,000 Czech crowns, which is roughly €40, with the condition that I remove the tyres and give him back the alloy rims afterwards, and that didn't include the steel wheels. So we actually had a set of 4 Vredestein tyres with decent tread on them, which was a lot better than the 2 Chinese summer tyres and 2 Bald winter tyres that came with the car. The car desperately needed an alignment, so we did an old-fashioned string and tape measure job to get the front wheels pointing in the right direction. We seemed to do a decent job since it did drive and brake in a straight line. The last thing to do before we could hit the road was to fit the fire extinguisher, which we found out at tech inspection wasn't even needed. When you're translating rules from Czech into English using Google Translate, it doesn't always display the word optional when it would really benefit you. So we got the car moving and run the engine for 15 minutes to try and bleed the cooling system. As with every project or track car, once the car was out of the warehouse and running, it still had a coolant leak, so we had to spend another 30 minutes trying to figure out where that was. Turns out that one of the hoses wasn't pushed all the way on before the Jubilee clip fastened, so it was an easy fix and we were on our way. About 15 minutes into the drive, the rear end of the car felt really bad and was making a nasty clunking noise. It was pretty hilarious as we opened the boot to see this staring back at us. Turned out there was an additional washer that was supposed to be fitted to the rear top mount, and without that it allowed the bush to pop out of the top mount. So we did the only thing we could do, harvested the wheels off the trolley jack and used them as the missing washer to get the car to the track. We did make it to the track about an hour before the tech inspection booth closed, but the main thing was we made it, and the car also passed tech inspection using the trolley jack wheels as top mounts, so I would call that a solid win. And that about wraps it up for this video. Stay tuned for the next video where the £600 BMW with Chinese coilovers and novice drivers do an endurance race. So like and subscribe if you're enjoying the videos so far, and I hope to see you in the next one. Ciao ciao!